So, my name's Dave Martill. I'm a professor of paleobiology at the University of Portsmouth, and I'm talking to you today from the Etches collection in Kimmeridge Village on the Dorset coast. And what I'm going to be talking about are pterosaurs. These are prehistoric flying reptiles from the Mesozoic that were occupying the skies over Dorset all during the Jurassic and the Cretaceous. And the time period that I'm going to be talking about, we do have some Triassic rocks, but they haven't yielded any pterosaurs. So we're going to be talking about rocks of early Jurassic age, of late Jurassic age, and from the early Cretaceous. And the places that we're going to be mentioning are over on the west of Dorset, over at Lyme Regis, where Mary Anning held sway. We're going to mention perhaps some fossils from Weymouth, certainly some fossils from Kimmeridge Bay and that coast along here. And also we're going to be talking about some fossils that come from just south of Swanage in Durlston Bay. So that's the scope of where we're talking about. So the Triassic strata, which are over in West Dorset, just beyond Lyme Regis and in Devon, they form part of the Jurassic Coast, but they're very, very poorly fossiliferous. And although vertebrate remains have been found there, nobody has yet found any remains of pterosaurs. So they're absolutely nothing, but we live in hope. So the first strata and the oldest strata that have pterosaurs in are lower Jurassic strata, what we know as the Lias group. And this is these are the rocks that Mary Anning collected many of her famous fossils from. It's an extremely fossiliferous part of the world, and flocks of people go there to find fossils, but pterosaurs are surprisingly rare. But Mary Anning did find pterosaur remains. In fact, she's credited with being the very first person to find remains that were recognized as those of pterosaurs. Some had been found before Mary Anning's time, but they'd been thought to be bird bones. In fact, some were found in Oxfordshire way back in the 1700s, but they were always thought to be bird bones. So Mary Anning found this animal, which is known as Dimorphodon, depicted on a 50p coin there. And the animal that she found probably looked something like this, characterized by a very long tail and really quite a massive head with a fearsome set of teeth. It was described by Dean William Buckland, and he originally named it Pterodactylus macronix. Pterodactylus was a genus of pterosaur that was already known. It had been described from Germany by Cuvier, and it was one of the very first names given to a pterosaur. The name macronix means large claw. This animal had large claws, and it was described in 1829. And these remains were the very first articulated and associated pterosaur remains to be found in the UK. This is the specimen. It looks a little bit like a dog's dinner there, the leftovers, but there are most of the elements of the skeleton. This part actually lacks the skull, but here's the shoulder girdle, and there's a limb bone here and the various wing bones, a little bit of a tangled mess, but nonetheless a very, very important specimen. Subsequently, some skulls of this animal were found. Mary Anning found one of these, and it is said that she made a drawing of it to send to London, and that this drawing was actually created using ink from a fossil squid found in Lyme Regis. So that's the skull. There it is the right way up. And as you can see, there are a few big teeth in there, and that's when it got its name. Here's a restoration of this animal. It's characterized by this very, very long tail, not very flexible. Lots and lots of fine bones gave that tail quite a stiffness. It had very, very long wings. And total, this animal was probably about the size of a buzzard. And you can see it's got this rather deepened skull with these very, very large cavities in it. That made it very, very light. It was Richard Owen who reappraised this animal, and he decided that it was nothing like the German Pterodactylus, and so he erected the name Dimorphodon for it in 1859. And he also did some really beautiful monographs describing the skeleton and illustrating it. And here's one of those specimens with that beautiful skull and the rest of the body there. It really is a very spectacular specimen. And what's really surprising is that since Mary Anning's time, hardly any more remains of this animal have been found. And just to emphasize the name of this genus, this Dimorphodon, it means the teeth of two different forms. These are the very large caniniform teeth, and if you look very closely along the jaw, you can see these very, very tiny little teeth here. So these two really very, very different types of teeth. You also see, here's one of its claws. There's a large claw there, which has somehow seemed to have got lodged in its nostrils. So that's Dimorphodon, and really is a spectacular specimen. Various people had attempts at restoring it. Here, one of Seeley's restorations in 1901 of Dimorphodon as a quadrupedal animal. A similar restoration also by Seeley showing it as a bipedal animal. And here's an attempt to put the wing membranes on the animal, but no attempt to put any meat on the bones or to restore the skull. But one man who did a restoration of it, there's lots of things wrong with this restoration, was the Reverend George Howman in Lyme Regis. And at the time that Buckland described the specimen that Mary Anning had found, remember that specimen didn't have a skull, that first specimen, George Howman did a restoration of Dimorphodon, and he gave it this head with this very, very long snout. That is Pterodactylus head, that very, very long snout. So he put the Pterodactylus head on it. He gave it a long tail. It's true it had a long tail, but we didn't know about its tail at the time, and we now know that its tail wasn't flexible, so it didn't have that. Interestingly, he put a little arrowhead on the end of the tail, and we do know that another pterosaur from the late Jurassic called Rhamphorhynchus actually did have a little flag at the end of its tail. So there's some things that are kind of ahead of the time, some things that are a little bit wrong, and one thing that is definitely wrong is he put claws at every single one of the wing bone joints, but that we know is now in error. And one might also argue that it's in error because it has Corfe Castle in the distance there, in its wrong place, and it also has a galleon there fighting against the wind. But of course, in those days, we had no idea how old the Earth was, and there was no reason to think that these things actually didn't even still exist somewhere in our only partially explored world. So they're the pterosaurs from the lower Jurassic. They are extremely rare. They should be more diverse. If we go elsewhere in the world, we find many more types of lower Jurassic pterosaurs. If we have a look at our middle Jurassic strata here on Dorset, again, we don't find any pterosaur remains. But if we went to Oxfordshire, we do. And so the next time on the Dorset coast we come up with pterosaur remains are in the upper Jurassic, and particularly in the Kimmeridge Clay Formation, which is one of the reasons why I'm here at the Etches collection. So the upper Jurassic pterosaurs are almost all of them from the Kimmeridge Clay Formation, and they can be found on the foreshore when the tide is out, and you can find their remains if you walk carefully over all of the ledges and look for their delicate bones. And here's actually one of the world's most famous pterosaurologists today. The gentleman over on the left-hand side there is David Unwin from Leicester University, and who's written books about pterosaurs and described many species of pterosaurs. And here he is down on the ledges having a look for pterosaur remains one summer a couple of years ago. Now, somebody who has found more pterosaur remains than anybody in the whole of the UK, and certainly more even than Mary Anning, is Dr. Steve Etches. Here he is in the Etches collection, and his collection actually contains some pretty spectacular remains of pterosaurs, some very, very important discoveries. And so if you come to the Etches collection, you certainly can see some of these pterosaur remains, and they really are rather lovely. Not all of them are skeletons or even partial skeletons. A lot of them are isolated bones, but they are beautifully preserved. You can see this almost gorgeous woody brown colour to a pterosaur humerus here and an ulna. It's a really, really lovely specimen. Unfortunately, it's not possible to say anything other than that it belongs to something like a Rhamphorhynchus. We can't tell you what genus it belongs to, but the specimens are preserved really beautifully. And here's the end of a femur. This is the ball joint that locks into the pelvis, but again, it's difficult to say what sort of pterosaur this isolated bone is from. But there are better remains. There are things that we can say what sort of pterosaur they are. This is the lower jaw of an animal known as Rhamphorhynchus. Rhamphorhynchus, like Dimorphodon in the lower Jurassic, had a long tail, but Rhamphorhynchus did have a rather pointy head with lots and lots of very slender, fine teeth. And one of my students, this is Michael O'Sullivan, he was studying the pterosaur remains from the Etches collection, and he came across this jaw, which is very, very similar to Rhamphorhynchus, but it differs from all of the other species, and he recognized that this is a distinct species. So this is actually the holotype of Rhamphorhynchus etchesi, and it also is one of the oldest specimens of Rhamphorhynchus, because elsewhere in the world, Rhamphorhynchus occurs in the very, very last stage of the Jurassic, known as the Tithonian, and here we have it in the Kimmeridgian. So it's actually amongst the oldest remains of Rhamphorhynchus. And I remember once, and I was actually on a field trip with Steve, walking along the ledges, and Steve suddenly dropped down onto the ground because he'd found this. And this is the pelvis of a pterosaur. It's very, very well preserved. You're looking at it from the underneath. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 vertebrae here, and these are the ribs that join the vertebrae to the pelvic girdle bones, and this is really quite distinctive, and it seems to belong to a group of pterosaurs known as Campalognathoidids, and these are more typical of the lower Jurassic, and so this is actually the youngest example of a Campalognathoidid pterosaur. Shame it's fragmentary, but it gives us hope that we might find more remains in the future. If you have a look at these animals from Germany, where they have complete specimens of Campalognathoidids, there's the pelvic girdle region. That's what Steve has found. It's perfectly possible that some of the isolated remains that are in the Etches collection might actually be other elements of the skeleton. But as of yet, we haven't found an associated skeleton, something to look forward to. And it probably looked something like this when it was alive. Now, one of the real prizes in the Etches collection is this pterosaur skull here, and this is a pterosaur which is now known as Cuspicephalus scarfi. And this was found right in Kimmeridge Bay, almost on the very first ledges where the access to the beach is. And Steve found this, and had he not found it, the next day this thing would have been washed away. A little bit of it has been lost, some of it has lost to the waves, and it's very, very fragile, very delicate. If Steve hadn't found it on that day, the next tide probably would have destroyed this specimen. Here's a restoration of it. We now know actually that it had rather more teeth than are in this restoration. Probably the teeth went back to about here. And it's a very, very slender skull. That's 5 centimeters there. And this has been called Cuspicephalus scarfi. You might wonder about that name. This is named after Gerald Scarfe. So why on earth would we name a pterosaur after Gerald Scarfe? He was a cartoonist for the Sunday Times for more than 50 years. And he was a political cartoonist. He was pretty savage as well. He did some pretty grotesque cartoons. If you're not a reader of the Sunday Times, then you may know Gerald Scarfe for the artwork that he did for Pink Floyd's The Wall. And if you aren't a fan of Pink Floyd or have never heard of that band, then you may remember him for being the artist that did the introductory scenes for the very, very popular BBC series, Yes, Minister. So that is his artwork. But what you may never have seen is the artwork that he did Mrs. Thatcher. This is Pterodactylus. And the big characteristic of Gerald Scarfe's artwork is that he does these elongate pointy faces. And because Cuspicephalus has got an elongate pointy face, and because Gerald Scarfe did this rather grotesque Pterodactylus of Margaret Thatcher, we thought it was appropriate to name this new pterosaur after Gerald Scarfe. So the Cuspicephalus part of the name means simply pointed head. And a journalist asked me what Gerald Scarfe said when I asked him if he would be happy to have a pterosaur named after him. And I said, no way did I ask Gerald Scarfe if I could have his permission to name it. And I said, because he never asks permission of the politicians if he can caricature them, so why should I ask his permission if I can name a pterosaur after him? And apparently that word got back to Gerald Scarfe, and he was rather taken by that. He quite liked it. So he got in touch with myself and with Steve, and he asked if he could come down and have a look at the specimen. And he was absolutely delighted to have had this specimen named after him. And he told us a story that he actually used to, as a child, visit Kimmeridge Bay for some of his family holidays. So he was actually really quite thrilled. And a restoration by one of my former PhD students, Mark Whidden, shows Cuspicephalus scarfi, what it might have looked like when it was alive. So there are spectacular specimens that are in the Etches collection, but some people had actually discovered pterosaurs in the Kimmeridge clay before Steve, but we have to go way back into Victorian times. And this is John Clavell Mansell Pleydell, and he was a natural historian in those days, back in the mid-1800s. And he was particularly a very keen on botany, but he also collected fossils. And amongst the remains that he found, which included plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, he also found some pterosaur bones. And there was all sorts of bones. This is the end of a humerus, the proximal end of a humerus. These are wrist bones. This is the palm of the hand of a Rhamphorhynchus. It's an absolutely spectacular, perfect 3D specimen. This is the first wing finger phalanx. Here's probably a piece of tibia or something like that. This is a wing bone with a very characteristic ridge. This is a wing finger bone that would have belonged to the animal that had a metacarpal looking like that. And this is the distal end of a humerus. So this is the elbow joint just in here. And all of this material actually was examined by Richard Owen, the guy who gave Dimorphodon that name. And he actually erected two taxa in honor of Mansell Pleydell, and one of them he called Pterodactylus manselli, and the other he called Pterodactylus pleidelli. But unfortunately, this material isn't diagnostic. So these remains, we don't know really what animal they're from. It is doubtful that they belong to the genus Pterodactylus. Perhaps they do. We need to find more substantial and articulated remains. Now, we're going to just quickly pop over the channel because the Kimmeridge Clay Formation doesn't just exist on the English side of the channel, it exists on the other side as well. If you go to Boulogne, the Boulonnais, there's lots and lots of Kimmeridge clay there. And also if you go over to Le Havre, this is Le Havre, entrance to the harbour. And these cliffs that overlook the English Channel there, they have chalk at the top, but at the bottom they have Kimmeridge clay, and you can find fossils there. And this is Dr. Eric Buffeteau, a good friend of mine, and he described some remains of pterosaurs from this locality. And what he found was a partial jaw, an upper jaw and a lower jaw, and this became known as Normanognathus after Normandy. So this means the Normandy jaw, and it was named, the species name Wellenhoferi. Peter Wellenhofer was a German paleontologist who pioneered the modern age of pterosaur studies back in the 1970s and 1980s. We may have remains of this on the English side of the channel, but because this is named on the basis only of jaw fragments, fitting the bones that we have that are probably related to this, we can't prove that our bones belong to this taxon until we find a complete or partial complete skeleton. So that summarizes all of the Jurassic pterosaurs, but Dorset also has quite a lot of Cretaceous strata on its coast, and the lower part of the Cretaceous has pterosaur remains. So this is Durlston Bay, and Durlston Bay is extremely fossiliferous, lots of erosion washing these rocks away, and just simply walking around this bay looking for fossils, you stand a chance of finding some pterosaur bones. So way back in late Victorian times, some pterosaurs were found there that back in 1959 were transferred over to the Natural History Museum. This is the upper jaw of a pterosaur that belongs to a group of pterosaurs known as Ctenacasmatids. These are the comb-toothed jawed pterosaurs. They have very long beaks, lots and lots of fine teeth, and were probably filtering out very small prey. And this one has a spoonbill type arrangement at the end. It's the only pterosaur that has this, and it's absolutely unique, and it's called Plateliorhynchus streptophorodon. It's a bit of a mouthful. The Plateliorhynchus, that is named after the spoonbill bird, that part of the name, and the rhynchus, of course, is the snout. The streptophorodon, that more or less means teeth with a collar around them. And it turns out, if you look at the sockets for the teeth here, they're elevated, like a little collar, and the teeth are sitting in there. So that's that part of the name. And this animal really would have been a beautiful looking creature. There's a spectacular restoration of this animal by Stafford Howes, who was a man who reappraised this in recent times. And that really is a truly lovely looking animal. Harry Govis-Seeley, working over in Cambridge, also had a look at some of material that came from Durlston Bay. Seeley was a real enthusiast. Now, what Seeley used to do was every time he found a pterosaur bone, or a pterosaur bone was brought to him, he gave it a new genus and species name. And I think he's credited with having described something like 45 different species of pterosaur. That list has been winnowed down to 6 or 7 now, but who could blame his enthusiasm? Here's one that he described. This is a thing called Gnathosaurus macrurus, and there is always a possibility that this could be a lower jaw of a Plateliorhynchus. It's a bit damaged here, and one might imagine this developing into a spoon, but there's a lot of bone missing and flaked off here. So not too sure about that one. But this is a really intriguing specimen. This is a vertebra from the neck. This is a cervical vertebra. And the interesting thing about it is how long it is. It's incredibly long. Now, 2 pterosaur types have long vertebrae. Tinocasmatids, with their filter-feeding dentitions, had long necks with long vertebrae. But there was another group known as the Ashdarchoids, and the Ashdarchoids had hyper-elongated vertebrae. And sometimes the vertebrae could be almost a meter long. One called Arenborgiana has the middle vertebra of the neck of something like 80 centimeters long, some really, really large vertebrae. Such that by the end of the Cretaceous, these Ashdarchoid pterosaurs had a neck length of perhaps 2 meters, maybe even more than 2 meters. And this isolated vertebrae turned up, and it was called Duratarhynchus. Now, its validity as a taxon is in considerable doubt. But whilst it does look a little bit like a tinocasmatid vertebra, it is excessively long. Now, the one thing that people kind of cling to keep it as a tinocasmatid is that it has a tiny, tiny little foramen on here. And this is apparently where an air sac system went into the bones. The bones were filled with air, made them much, much lighter. But its length and all of the other features are very, very consistent with it being an Ashdarchoid. And it may be that it's a very early Ashdarchoid. Typically, later Ashdarchoids from the late Cretaceous, they do not have any of these foramina on the side. But early Ashdarchids surely must have had the foramina and then subsequently lost them. So it is possible that this is from an Ashdarchid. Now, why do I think that? Well, there have been some remains found at Durlston Bay that suggest that there are Ashdarchoids in the Dorset assemblage. This is the Square and Compass pub. If you don't know it, you should go and check it out. It's at Worth-Matravers. It's a splendid pub. They make their own cider on the premises, and they've got a single microbrewery which is supplying them with beer, and it's really lovely. And in this part of the pub, there is a small museum. And this museum was assembled by the previous landlord and his son, Charlie Newman. And Charlie is not only a landlord, but is an enthusiastic fossil collector, and a very good one at that. And he found this. This is in the collection. You can go and see this. And this is an Ashdarchoid metacarpal. It's characterized by being very long and also by having this constriction here and a very typical little foramina at the end. And this is from an Ashdarchoid pterosaur. Now, Ashdarchoid pterosaurs grew to immense sizes. This is Charlie at the site looking for more remains. And the reason we're looking for more remains is because this animal would look something like this. This is a lanka from the early Cretaceous of Morocco, from North Africa, and it has metacarpal bones which are remarkably similar to the one found at Durlston. This animal likely had a wingspan of 8 meters, and while so far we've only found a single metacarpal, it gives us hope that we're going to find some really spectacular pterosaurs on the Dorset coast. And I'm going to leave you with that thought that there is an incredible amount of research still to be done. It needs people to go out and find fossils.
Right, how's everybody?
We're good, thank you. And I'm hoping everyone enjoyed your talk, and we'll get some questions coming through shortly. Thank you again for doing this for us. It's greatly appreciated.
Yeah, my pleasure. So I was racking my brains while I was watching it to think if I'd missed anything, because the thing is that Steve's collection has actually got an incredible amount of material in it.
We recently had the discovery in Scotland, wasn't it? There was what was supposedly the largest Jurassic pterosaur.
Yes,
we know it's true. We know it's more the largest that had existed by that time.
Well, maybe. It's a great discovery. It's found on the Isle of Skye. It's actually the second pterosaur to be found on the Isle of Skye. But it's a remarkably complete skeleton with a skull. Everything's associated and some bones are articulated. So I don't want to knock the discovery in any way, but their calculations, they probably need to relook, to go over their calculations again, because they calculated its wingspan comparing it with Rhamphorhynchus. And Rhamphorhynchus is actually quite an unusual Jurassic pterosaur in that some of its wing finger bones are extraordinarily long. So the ratios between the bones are rather different from the type of pterosaur that the Scottish specimen is. The Scottish specimen is quite closely related to a thing called Cerasipterus and another thing called Angusipterus, known from China. And they have a different wing structure. And if you actually scale it up using those pterosaurs, I'm afraid to say that the wingspan comes down a little bit, and it takes it out of the record books, I'm afraid. But it's actually a spectacular specimen. It's a really amazing discovery, and I don't want to denigrate it in any way. It really is a super discovery. I think there's actually some specimens in Steve Etches' collection that actually are record-breaking Jurassic pterosaurs, and we need to have a look at those and measure them.
Yeah, based on what he's told me and what I've seen, it's supposedly that some of his bones would scale up to about 5 meters in a wingspan. But
yes, there are a couple of bits and pieces in there that make you think, wow, there were some big pterosaurs. The crazy thing is, why haven't we found them? You would think that bigger bones would stand out a bit more of us. There's also a place in Germany called Solnhofen, and they've got lots and lots of really, really good, perfect specimens of Pterodactylus and Tinocasmatids and things like that. And they've got a few bones of really big ones. And it's really weird because they've got excellently preserved small pterosaurs, but only broken bits of really big pterosaurs. So there's something bizarre going on there.
Maybe the larger pterosaurs at the time were more like wandering albatross, perhaps. So they would have been.
Yes, maybe they traveled huge distances and chose better places to die than the Solnhofen lagoons.
But it's interesting you mentioned that, because Steve actually came back with probably his largest pterosaur wing bone last week, a week before, I think.
Yeah. Seriously?
Yeah.
Ask him why he didn't email me and tell me.
Because he's still in the preparation phase of it.
Oh, right. He's still.
But it's about 9 inches long, I think. 23, 37,
all right.
Something like that.
Well, let's have a look at that then. We might get the Etches collection into the record books.
That'd be fantastic. Would always be nice. We've had our first question for you, which is, why did these reptiles get bigger over time?
Good question. I think that some of this is down to the way they engineered their bones. Lots and lots of pterosaurs were really quite small, with wingspans of around about 1 meter, 1.5 meters, 2 meters for much of the Triassic and the Jurassic. And then their ecology seemed to change somewhere around about the upper Jurassic, and they started to get a little bit larger. By the time you get into the early Cretaceous, there are some examples of pterosaurs which had wingspans that might have been about 8 meters. We're working on some now from Morocco that had really, really large sizes. I'll just show you one bone. I don't know whether my camera is going to pick that up. This is a very grotty looking piece of bone. It's actually a piece of scapular coracoid, the shoulder girdle. Here's, tell me, can you see these all right? Because I can't see them on my screen.
They're a little blurry, but we can see them.
Okay, well, the bone that I'm holding in my right hand, which has got a sort of a C shape to it, is a shoulder girdle from an animal that has got a wingspan of probably around about 4 to 5 meters. The fragment of bone that I've got in my left hand is actually, if you can just see some lumps on this piece, this is that first lump there, this little dash here, and you can see the massive size difference. And this is a fragment of a pterosaur with a wingspan that is probably going to be 8 meters or thereabouts. It doesn't matter whether it's 7 meters or 8 meters or 9 meters. It's certainly something that you wouldn't want perched on a tree when you've just polished a car. So these pterosaurs were getting bigger, and the reason is that evolution was coming up with different innovations to let them make their bones thinner but stronger. So if you study the microstructure of the bones, and if you study the internal structure of the bones, you'll see that there's all sorts of beautiful bits of engineering going on. So for example, when you see a great big crane at a building site, you see that the tower of the crane is a long skinny structure, just 4 strips of metal with some cross struts between them. And the jib of the crane is just 3 struts of metal with crisscross metal girders between them as well. And there's hardly any material there, and yet they're incredibly strong. And pterosaurs do that with their bones. They put these little cross struts inside, and they're ever so carefully positioned. They really are very, very precisely positioned. And they have exactly the right number of them. If you actually cut a bone open and you have a look inside and you do some modeling in the computer, you find that there's kind of an optimum number. And the pterosaurs have this optimum number. They also make their bone out of incredibly finely layered bone. So it's a little bit like plywood, ply bone, with fibers going in different directions. And they'll perhaps have something like 250, 300, 400 of these layers for a millimeter thick bone. I mean, it's incredible. And it's this engineering of the bone that allowed them to make these great big long finger bones and have these bizarre cross-sectional shapes that gave them extra strength, like triangular shapes or T-shaped cross sections. And it's this engineering that allowed them to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And had they not become extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, where the largest pterosaurs ever lived, they may have, had they had a future, they may have got even bigger still. I mean, we now are pretty certain that some of those pterosaurs had 9-meter wingspans. And we have bits and pieces of skeletons that suggest even larger sizes. Arenborgiania, for example, might have had an 11-meter wingspan, which is the same size as a Spitfire.
Wow, Christ. Mark has come back with an interesting thought on the matter. Also ties into something else I'll ask you in a minute. It states that could it be that birds took over the smaller ecological niches gradually during the Cretaceous, and due to their size, unlike the larger pterosaurs, they survived the Katy extinction?
Yeah, well, we do lose the smaller pterosaurs, and there is a sort of feeling that during the early Cretaceous we have lots and lots of smaller birds, but we also have now started to find smaller pterosaurs in the Cretaceous as well. So I don't think that that is the case. I think that probably there was some shifting of niches, but by and large, I don't think that's the case. We have done a study that suggests that the small pterosaurs, the small pterosaur species in, say, the Jurassic, the lower Jurassic, middle and parts of the upper Jurassic, were actually kind of replaced by the juveniles of the big pterosaurs. So when you think of a big animal like Quetzalcoatlus or Arenborgiania with these huge big wingspans, of course, these animals hatched from probably very, very small eggs. A really big pterosaur doesn't actually have a really big body. It is all wings and neck and skull, and the body is actually quite small. Take a look at any picture of Pteranodon. You'll see that the body is really quite small for a 6-meter wingspan animal. And there's another one called Arthrodactylus, which has a 4.5, 5-meter wingspan. And again, the body is tiny and the size of a grapefruit. So I think that what happened was that they gave birth. They laid eggs that hatched into small pterosaurs, and the small pterosaurs were simply the babies of the giants. And however long it took them to grow up, they would have been out there competing with the other smaller pterosaur species. So I'm not so sure how important the birds are, but it's a great question, and there may be a component of it. It may be that some pterosaur species were outcompeted by birds, but we have to accept that there must have been small pterosaurs for them to grow into giant pterosaurs.
Yeah. Elizabeth has asked, has recent research shed any more light on the origins of pterosaurs?
Sadly, no. It would be really, really nice to have an evolutionary sequence that shows the forelimbs of a sort of, let's say, a lizard grade reptile into something resembling a pterosaur, but there really isn't such an animal. It's going to be somewhere in the middle Triassic. But here's a reason why we're probably struggling to find it. It's highly likely that pterosaurs evolved flight by being arboreal animals that were eventually kind of jumping from branch to branch. And the further the branches are away, the better it is if you can kind of glide and fly. And this is certainly the model that you get perhaps for bats and things like that. So there's arguments, different arguments for birds, of course, because they've not coupled their hind limbs with their wings. But pterosaurs and bats have. So it's likely that they evolved from tree-dwelling animals. And generally speaking, if you live in a forest, that's not a great place to be preserved as a fossil. You stand a much better chance of being preserved as a fossil if you're flying over a lake. Now, of course, you could fly out of a forest and fly over the lake and get in there. We have fossils from the Triassic that are of the oldest pterosaurs, but every aspect of their skeleton shows them modified for flight, and they just look like regular pterosaurs. They do not look like a halfway house between a pterosaur and a putative pterosaur ancestor. So this is a good reason to go fossil collecting. Now, sadly, you won't be able to do that in the UK. If you want to look for the earliest ancestor of pterosaur, I think you're going to have to do it in the European Triassic, maybe in Italy or Switzerland or Austria, somewhere like that, where they have these very special deposits with very, very well preserved skeletons in. And I think that that's the place to look. I don't think it's worth looking in the UK, for example.
Huh. That's very interesting. We've had another question. We are learning more about fossilized skin. Do we have any record of what the skin of these creatures was like?
We have some excellent specimens of pterosaurs which preserve their skin, especially the skin of the wing membrane. In some places, we've actually found well-preserved skin that has the internal structure. So we're able to see stiffening fibers, blood vessels, a spongy tissue, and a very, very thin epidermis. Where we've seen the epidermis, it actually looks a little bit like the skin between your thumb and your second finger. And if you look at that skin in there, you'll see that it's got lots and lots of little crisscross patterns, and pterosaur skin actually looks a little bit like that, where the wing is closer to the body. Elsewhere, the wing seems to have a fibrous appearance. And there are also pterosaurs which show what looks like a sort of a pelt on the body, but that's incredibly controversial. Some people have suggested that they have a fur made of things that might be proto-feathers, suggesting a relationship with the other archosaurs, like the feathered dinosaurs and the feathered birds. But that's incredibly controversial at the moment.
Okay. It's interesting you mentioned that, because I'm coming back to the birds thing, because I know one of our guests tonight mentioned to me on the phone the earliest bird, the Archaeopteryx. Where does that kind of sit in this evolutionary tree of competing with the pterosaurs of the time?
Well, I don't know whether he was competing with the pterosaurs, because Archaeopteryx, of which there's been about 13 specimens now found from Solnhofen, is found alongside pterosaurs. And both of those organisms, the Archaeopteryx as a proto-bird and the pterosaurs, then went on to survive for another 60-odd million years. So those things, they were living alongside each other, and maybe there was some competition, but Archaeopteryx and pterosaurs are found in the same deposits. Archaeopteryx is incredibly rare. It's actually only found in the Solnhofen limestone, whereas pterosaurs are found through a much bigger range. But Archaeopteryx, of course, gave rise to lots and lots of other small dinosaurs, and you know, pterosaurs must have been flying around these as well. So birds and pterosaurs were living alongside each other for a very, very long time. Very long time indeed. And in fact, they were living alongside each other in lots of different environments as well, because eventually birds returned to the seas and became flightless before the end of the Cretaceous, things like Hesperornis. And so while Pteranodon was flying over the chalk seas of Kansas, there was a bird called Hesperornis that was swimming and diving in the very same sea. Highly likely they were chasing the same fish. Maybe you could imagine a Hesperornis diving down to go and take fish like a penguin, while pelicans are diving down next to the penguins. If you think about the seaboard off of Peru, when they have those big anchovy shoals, boobies and pelicans dive in from the sky, while penguins are swimming all around taking the fish. And one might imagine in the Cretaceous seas of Kansas, pteranodon diving down to pick up fishes, while Hesperornis is swimming directly into the shoal. So, you know, these things are all happily living alongside. It's the poor old fish we've got to feel sorry for.
That actually brings up a thought which you asked, really, and it was when we recorded your presentation and we looked at some of the illustrations, and one of the things that got brought up was color. And yes, my answer to Nick was presumably because if you look at birds of today and the traits, there isn't that much predation between those kind of things or predators for them to run from. So I guess they were kind of free to evolve whatever color for mating rituals or whatever kind of purpose they had. So it's quite reasonable to speculate that they were as colorful as depicted in
I would imagine so. There is one really rather nice pterosaur that's in a museum in Utah, a place called Blanding, and it's got a head crest, and in the head crest has got stripes on it. We don't know what color those stripes were, but one would imagine that they would likely be quite striking. There's not much point in having a really elaborate head crest that's for ornament if you don't make it colorful. So if you want to attract the ladies, then, you know, a great big head crest with lots of bright color on it might go a long way to draw their attention. So I imagine that if they had a head crest, they likely had quite bright colors on it. And certainly that's what you see in birds. Look at the bills of toucans and lots of other birds that have head crests on them have got a good splash of color. And look at the wattles and things that you find on chickens and things. So lots and lots of color being splashed around. I wouldn't say that they were short of predators, though. There's a series of neck vertebrae of a pterosaur from Brazil that has a spinosaur tooth wedged in them, and there's some bones of a pterosaur known from the United States which have got a velociraptor tooth wedged in them as well. So and I've been finding lots of pterosaur bones in Morocco, and they have bite marks all over them. One of my PhD students has just got a paper that he's about to submit actually describing some of these bite marks. So they weren't short of predators, but of course being able to take to the skies gave them a really, really good opportunity to at least escape from their predators, hopefully mostly.
Yeah, actually, you saying that does remind me that I know that Steve's got predation evidence on pterosaur bones. But I suppose the thing about that is you could argue that with fossil evidence, fossils are so rare anyway, what you're going to end up finding is a lot more of the scattered bones, which are chances are the predated animals than you would the non-predated animals.
Yeah, so, well, if you look at the if you look at the Solnhofen limestone pterosaurs, I mean, there's lots of them that are absolutely perfect. They really are perfect, and there's not a hint of predation on them. But there is a really super example of a Rhamphorhynchus and a big fish called Aspidorhynchus, and the Aspidorhynchus has got some of the pterosaur in its mouth, and it's highly unlikely that the Aspidorhynchus was feeding on the pterosaur. It's much more likely that the Aspidorhynchus and the pterosaur were both feeding on a shoal of very small fishes, which are known as Leptolepis. And these little fishes, they would have been in their thousands. In fact, sometimes you find a bedding plane with thousands of them on it. And just like I was describing for the western seaboard of South America, Peru, with pterosaurs diving from the skies and other things in the water there. If you imagine those anchovies being picked on by all of the bigger fishes coming from underneath and birds coming from the top, well, in the Solnhofen lagoons, Aspidorhynchus was coming from underneath and Rhamphorhynchus was coming from above. And just once in a while, I think that the sharp snout of an Aspidorhynchus went through the wing membrane of a Rhamphorhynchus, and it couldn't get off because all of the backward pointing teeth prevented it from escaping. Presumably the fish would then take a dive down into deeper water, that would drown the pterosaur. And unless the fish could actually shake off the dead pterosaur, the fish would then be unable to feed, and eventually it would die itself. And hence this wonderful fossil of a Rhamphorhynchus wrapped around an Aspidorhynchus as discovered. But that's a one-off. That's one of these real smoking gun fossils.
We have a question which might take me a while to read. I understand that as dark kids had quite small feet. Given that, I believe there were more forest fires in the Cretaceous, and that there were more forest fires in the Cretaceous. Could a reasonable hypothesis these birds fed on forest fire kills, and given their wing size and warm air, they could quickly mobile away from any theropod dinosaurs and could search vast for scavenging animals?
I think anything's possible. I don't know whether we know that there were more forest fires, but what we do know is that there certainly were forest fires. You only have to process a little bit of sediment and you'll find little bits of charcoal. We certainly find charcoal in the plant debris beds here on the Isle of Wight in the early Cretaceous. You know, there's lots of evidence that there were forest fires, and I found them in the Santana Formation where we get lots of pterosaurs as well. But forest fires have been always a part of Earth history. You only need a forest and a lightning strike and you've got a forest fire. So any of those options, of course, are perfectly possible.
I suppose coming back to that, you mentioned lightning strikes. With the higher density, the hot temperatures, etc., I imagine lightning strikes would have been more regular and more violent than they are today anyway.
They may well have been. There's certain times when in the Cretaceous we were in what was called a greenhouse planet. And certainly by the time you get to the middle of the Cretaceous, let's say around about 100 million years ago, sea levels are rising, temperatures are rising. There is certainly no ice on the poles for most of the late Cretaceous. There might have been some severe winters on continents up at high latitudes, but there certainly wasn't any ice. And sea levels were the highest that they've ever been on the planet as far as we're able to calculate. But one of the things that did was, of course, that it actually decimated all of the forests that were on the coastal plains that would have been so extensive in the Jurassic, or in the very, very lower part of the Cretaceous, when the sea levels were much lower. So there's an incredible dynamic going on there, all of which are going to be affecting pterosaur abundance and affecting their evolution. But those same physical effects of the planet will also be affecting all of the other animals. And it's very difficult to, when you look at the evolution, whether you're looking at the dinosaurs or whether you're looking at the pterosaurs, it's very difficult to actually try to work out what are the drivers for the what we would call the macro evolutionary patterns that you see. It's great fun to try though, and it's always great fun to try to think of another part of the equation that you can plug in.
I imagine it must be quite complicated working out those factors because you never really know, and they're over such a long, extensive.
Well, that's why we can never be wrong, isn't it? We can be quite smug about that.
Well, this is the thing. Like, we're looking at hundreds of millions of years, and well, with the evidence we have being that less than 1% of everything fossilizes, it's very difficult to try and put together a full story of how, what, when, and why, I suppose.
Well, in the world of pterosaurs, we've had several revolutions in our understanding of pterosaurs in the last 50 years. There were two deposits that came to light in Brazil during the 1990s. One of these was called the Crato Formation, another was called the Santana Formation, and both of them yield pterosaurs. Pterosaurs were being found in the Santana Formation first, and the wonderful thing about that deposit was that the bones were three-dimensional, absolutely three-dimensional, and this allowed you to prepare the bones out and actually work out how one bone functioned against another. So you could actually work out how wide an elbow could be flexed or something like that. Then the deposit underneath, called the Crato Formation, started to yield pterosaurs as well. And both of these deposits started to yield pterosaurs that we'd never seen before, whole new groups, things like tapijarids came, Tupuxuara, and others as well besides. And then China started to produce pterosaurs in what's known as the J-hole group, especially in what's known as the Yixiang Formation. And again, they started to yield, either they yielded pterosaurs that were completely new to us, or they were yielding pterosaurs that were much more complete, than we'd known from some scrappy remains. And both of these places, Brazil and China, more than doubled the number of species of pterosaurs that were known before the 1990s, and have added considerably to our understanding of pterosaur biology. But then while this was going on, some of the deposits which we, I guess, had taken for granted and thought we'd got all the pterosaurs, in Germany, strata just above the Solnhofen limestone, called the Mornsine limestone, actually started yielding a lot of new pterosaurs as well. And we've just recently just described a new one, which hopefully the paper will come out fairly soon, the likes of which no one's ever seen before. And there's been 3 or 4 of those. So for some reason, the last 50 years has seen many, many more pterosaur discoveries than were made during the whole of the 100 or even 200 years before that.
Except, as you mentioned in your talk, in the case of Lyme Regis and West Dorset.
Well, the funny thing about that is that there are more paleontologists go to Lyme Regis, I would imagine, than any other part of the UK, maybe even part of the world. It's such a mecca for people to go and have a look for fossils. And it doesn't matter whether you're a very talented and skillful collector and have been, have got, 50 years of practice under your belt, or whether you're a kid. In fact, on the Isle of Wight, we've twice had children discover new species of pterosaurs. And it seems really odd that hardly any material has been found. Every year people find pterosaurs. Every year people find ichthyosaurs, and plesiosaurs are not so rare. And just occasionally a dinosaur turns up as well, like a Scelidosaurus. But those pterosaurs, they seem to be very, very reluctant to come out of the ground. And I don't know why that is. I suspect it's that they were not marine animals. It is probably not right to say compare them to a seagull if you're going to compare them to a bird, and to say actually it's more likely, this is looking at its claws, it's much more likely a forest animal, and the chances of a forest animal getting 100 miles out to sea is actually pretty slim. So it might be that they just are incredibly rare.
Yeah, I know there was recently a discovery down there because Steve prepared it himself. It had the claws and some of the vertebrae there, but that's been added to the fossil database for West Dorset, because obviously the sad thing about West Dorset is
I saw that specimen. It really is quite intriguing. What I would imagine might happen is if we do find something, I would not be surprised if the next thing that turned up wasn't just a completely new species. It seems really odd to me that if you go around the rest of the world looking at lower Jurassic pterosaurs, and if you have a look at what we believe to be an evolutionary model for pterosaurs, there should be more than just Dimorphodon in the lower Jurassic. You kind of think, well, if we're going to find another pterosaur, you ought to stand a really good chance of it actually being a new genus and species. So I wish some people would actually find something, and that would be really good.
Yeah, I imagine you'd still have those kind of water bird equivalent niches as well within the environment. So presumably there must be something out there.
No, hopefully you would, but we don't see anything that is actually looking as though it is really modified for an aquatic existence. I mean, if you look at the skull of Dimorphodon, it's really rather high. You would expect more streamlining if something is going to be spending a good amount of its time, or something elongate, or with a bill like a heron or something like that for stabbing at fishes. So the morphology of it isn't really that of an aquatic animal, and it's looking at its claws, it's much more likely to be a forest dwelling animal. But it's a very, very tough game trying to actually put an ecology on these things, because they are just so different from everything else. There isn't an equivalent looking animal in the world today that you would compare with a Dimorphodon.
We've got another question about the fibrous nature of the pterosaur wing membranes, and I suppose it does actually bode a question in relation to bats, because it's asking if they would have be better adapted to fine-tuning wing movements in flight compared to birds. So to add to that, I imagine with bats they can individually control the fingers. Do we know if there's any pterosaurs with that ability as well?
No, they've got 3 fingers that stick out from the front of the wing, which they presumably use when they're walking on all fours as hands, or maybe if they have a grip to a branch or something like that. And they're actually really quite well developed, although they're very small compared to their wing finger. They are very, very well developed, and I think that they only became highly reduced in one group right at the end of the Cretaceous, the nyctosaurs. So they needed their hands for something. I doubt it was for manipulating food, because I think that they couldn't actually reach the mouth with them. But if you have a look at the pterosaur wing, it has the ability to control it by using the hind feet, because the membrane attaches to the ankle. They can flex a little bit the wing finger, but not very much. They can flex the wing at the end of the metacarpal. There's a roller joint on there which allows them to fold the wing up for when they're walking. But they could also make adjustments on that when they're flying. They can't move the wrist very much. The bones of the wrist, they really lock together. The radius and the ulna lock into a bone which goes across both of the radius and the ulna. And that bone, what's called a proximal carpal, snugly fits into its counterpart, the distal carpal, which also snugly fits onto the metacarpal. So the wrist is actually locked really quite tight. But the elbow is very, very movable, and the shoulder is very, very movable. So they've got loads and loads of options for control. But what we found when we were studying the wing membranes was that the fibers that are in the wing that give it some rigidity, stop it fluttering in the wind, they have some cross muscle fibers going over them. And we think that the wing is actually possibly quite sensitive and actually able to modify itself internally. So it might be that it's a smart material, not just a piece of taut skin stretched like when a bat, not a bat, when a flying fox, one of those flying squirrels glides from a tree. They simply put out their limbs and stretch that membrane. It's effectively, they've got big armpits, and they don't really do too much in the way of control. They have got some control of the flight, but not very much.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, did we capture Steve's comment for a beginner? Pterosaurs are reptiles. Pterosaurs. Sorry, I apologise. Are reptiles and not dinosaurs? I think that was his question.
No, they absolutely aren't dinosaurs. But in some evolutionary models, they're actually the sister group to dinosaurs. So think of them as sort of cousins. There is a group of animals which are called the ornithodyrans. And dinosaurs are ornithodyrans, dinosaurs and birds, and pterosaurs are argued to be ornithodyrans. There's lots of characters that they seem to share. But the problem with trying to work out the evolutionary relationships of pterosaurs is that their skeleton has been so highly modified that everything is to do with flying, landing, and taking off. And so many of the bones have changed their morphology that trying to work out their true evolutionary relationships is really, really quite difficult. It's a little bit like when you're trying to work out what a whale is. It really, really doesn't look like a hippopotamus, but it's highly likely that they're actually quite closely related. But the one thing a hippopotamus doesn't do is look like a whale, and the one thing a whale doesn't do is look like a hippopotamus. And the same thing is true of pterosaurs. The pterosaur skeleton doesn't look anything like that of a dinosaur. There are some features of the skull that they share in common, but they share those in common with other animals as well.
It's a very interesting subject, I suppose. There's lots and lots to learn, and I guess there are being same issue with dinosaurs, I suppose, as non-marine animals or as an animal group. The fossils are harder to come by because presumably with land animals and, as you said, forest environments, you don't get as many fossils because the sediments aren't designed for or perfect for kind of fossilization.
Well, regarding pterosaurs, because they're so mobile, they can more or less end up in any type of sediment. But it's much better if you find them in a lagoon or a lake deposit, nice quiet conditions with some very, very soft mud at the bottom, then they stand a chance of sinking into the mud. And if they can do that, then you can get a really good fossil. But we do find them in terrestrial environments. And one of the things that is really remarkable is our sites in Morocco that we work on. They have pterosaur bones that are almost certainly the leftovers of dinosaur or crocodile dinner. And they get washed from the banks in floods, big floods, and flushed into the deeper channels of the river. And they're all chaotically distributed. But bizarrely, they're amongst the most perfect bones we've ever found. And when we analyze the bone structure, they've got even some of the most remarkable cell structure preserved. And so we end up with the grottiest of remains being absolutely perfectly preserved. So there's all sorts of anomalies that go on with fossilization. We call the study of this taphonomy. But pterosaurs are found in a very wide range of deposits. And somebody's recently in the United States claimed to have found a pterosaur in a desert sand dune.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, which is the least likely place you would expect to find something.
It really is. Completely random question then, before we come to the next one that's been asked. The life cycle then, I presume pterosaurs were egg layers.
Well, we know that they were egg layers. We have some pterosaurs with eggs in the body, and we have pterosaur eggs and pterosaurs associated with the eggs. There was a big site in China which yielded a whole range of pterosaurs, including some juveniles and some eggs. We know that the eggs were at least partially soft-shelled because we've seen bent and distorted eggs where they're bent instead of cracked. And we've got some deposits which have got very, very small pterosaurs in, such that we think that pterosaurs hatched and could fly pretty quickly. So we think that they were really quite precocious, just like a chick, a hen's egg will hatch, and within a matter of minutes, once he's dry, the little chick stands up and starts pecking around for food and can walk. We certainly can't fly, but we think that pterosaurs might be able to fly straight after hatching, because an egg specimen was found in China with an embryonic pterosaur inside, and it had fully developed wings with fully ossified bone, and the wing element ratios were very similar to those of an adult, implying that it was already ready for flight. Whereas when a bird hatches, the wing still hasn't grown, and whilst a bird might be able to walk okay, they certainly can't fly. So the bone, the sort of a delayed development of the bird wing, I think maybe you can't squeeze enough feathers into the egg. But with pterosaurs, they seem to have had enough yolk and phosphate to be able to grow the entire skeleton and ossify it ready for flight.
Oh, amazing. So the next question we've got then is, how active were pterosaurs at flying? Was it lots of flapping or mainly soaring like eagle?
Difficult to know, because they don't leave much of a record of their flight. You find their footprints, and there's one place where they've found a landing mark, when all of a sudden the footprints appear and then disappear. They found a takeoff print. The great big ones, of course, it's highly likely that they were lazy flyers and they did an enormous amount of gliding. When you've got a wingspan of perhaps 11 meters, that's a huge surface area of wing. You don't need much of a thermal to keep that up in the air. Just think of the size of a kite that you can fly. All you need to do is sort of catch the slightest bit of breeze or bit of thermal, make some adjustments. You can probably stay up there for an enormous long time. I would not be surprised if they underwent some pretty large migrations, to be honest.
I presume from the structure, with the membranes going down to the hind feet, you'd probably be less flapping and more gliding.
Bats do an enormous amount of flapping, incredible flappers. And their membranes are tied to their back legs, so I don't buy that.
Fair enough, just a random thought.
No, you're allowed random thoughts, but
I know nothing.
Go ahead, have as many as you like.
That's why I'm asking the question.
So I just had a call actually from Phil at Southampton, and I hope I do this justice. His question was that I think we're finding lots of species. Are we naming them too quickly? I think was what his question was. Are we finding? Are we naming too many of the species that we're finding without doing research on them? I believe that.
No, I don't know that anybody names a species without doing any research on them. You won't get away with that. If you're going to name a species, you're going to have to submit it to a scientific journal, and those scientific journals send the papers out to scrutiny. One argument that you might make is that we sometimes name species when we could do with better quality material. For example, I've named 5 or 6 different species on the basis of jaws alone. But if we don't name them, we don't get very far. You know, we just stick them in a drawer and they kind of get forgotten about. And if we just simply wait until we get the complete skeleton, well, we might wait for several lifetimes. So I think that the nice thing to do is, if you have got something and you can diagnose it, if you can say, look, I've got this beak here and it is different from every other pterosaur. I've compared it to all of these other pterosaurs and it's got these features that distinguish it and make it look different, then stick a name on it. Because if you describe it and you don't stick a name on it, you can bet your bottom dollar that someone is going to come along later on and go, oh, and they didn't name this, so I'm going to propose the name X for it. And, you know, all of a sudden you've lost the ability to have a pterosaur and for you to name it.
Wonderful. Did we have any other questions for the subject or on the subject? I guess not. It was I think in that case, I think we're pretty much done.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
Well, thank you again for joining us, Dave.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
And thank you for doing this talk and coming over and recording it. It's greatly appreciated. I hope I did your edit justice for your lecture.
I think you did.
Are you working on anything exciting at the moment?
I'm always working on exciting things. I don't work on dull and boring things. So okay. I leave those alone. Just to give you an idea, I'm working on a couple of new pterosaurs at the moment. My student and I are working on a great big project that was looking at the preservation of pterosaurs, and we've got some very, very exciting stuff that we're doing with dinosaurs. As soon as the COVID situation lets us get back out into the field, which we think we're getting there, but not every country has yet opened up their borders, and we're waiting for a couple of countries to relax their rules and regulations so that we can get back out in the field. We've got some incredibly exciting stuff just on the boil, and we're seriously itching to get back into the field to go and get back to work.
All right, brilliant. Well, it's good to know, and we look forward to seeing what you come up with and what's next.
Okay, right. Cheers then, everybody.
Right. Thank you.
Take care.